Hi, welcome back to our study on the Apostle Paul. For this study, we are looking at his time in Caesarea, which is a city up on the Mediterranean coast, a little north of Jerusalem. I'm Pastor Guy Williams here at First United Methodist Church in Dayton, Texas. Our mission as a church is to lead people into a growing relationship with Jesus. And so I'm hoping that in these studies in Paul, that they'll help you to grow in your relationship with Jesus by looking at Paul's life and following how his life and ministry and his mission unfolded, what it was like for him to follow Jesus, that we can draw lessons and inspiration and encouragement from that as well. So let's get started. Last session, Paul was in Jerusalem. He got into trouble. There was basically a mob that was stirred up by false accusations against him. But you don't need accusations to be correct for a mob to get stirred up, and so that's what happened with Paul in this case. He was taken into prison by the Roman guards. They wanted to avoid the community getting stirred up. They like to just keep the peace. So they weren't as interested in everyone getting justice as they were in keeping the peace. So they got Paul locked away in prison. He's a Roman citizen, which means he does have certain rights and that they do have to honor those. So they're sort of stuck in a way. And he discovered a plot, Paul did, against his life by his nephew heard about it. And so he relayed that to Paul. Paul sent him to the commander of the Roman guard. And that's what leads him to be transferred up to Caesarea, this city on the sea. So in our reading for today, we're looking at Acts chapter 23, verse 24 through the end of chapter 26. So he's transferred up. They send him up under cover of night. And in chapter 24, he begins his, he has a hearing with a local governor whose name is Felix. Now the local governors there, Felix and after him Festus, they are essentially folks who are there to attend to either the finances or to a small province for the Roman government, or both. There is a king of Judea. In this case, it is Herod Agrippa, and he's just referred to as Agrippa by Luke here in Acts. And he is the king over this province of Judea, but they do have these governors over a smaller province or responsible for the finances and that sort of thing. So they have some authority as well. All of them are really under the umbrella of the Roman emperor. So that's who's ultimately in charge, but they have to figure out what to do with problems that come up. So he has a trial before Felix. Some of the people from Jerusalem come up. The high priest comes up 5 days later, it says in chapter 24, verse 1. Ananias, a different Ananias who Paul met earlier, obviously, but Ananias is the high priest now, and he goes up to Caesarea. Or goes down rather, because everything from Jerusalem's perspective is down from Jerusalem being the highest point, both geographically and spiritually. So they go down to Caesarea, but it's really north, we would say go up. And so they present their case, they present the charges. Felix takes a listen, Paul responds, and he speaks to them. He tries to set the record straight, but eventually he simply says that it's not about me having defamed the temple, which was the accusation and stirring up trouble. It was, as he says in verse 21, it is concerning the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial before you today. Now that is kind of getting into the doctrine and belief system. But it says in verse 22 that Felix, who was well acquainted with the way, and again, the way was an early term for describing the followers of Jesus and this, not a new religion really yet, so much as just a group or a sect who believed that Jesus was the Messiah, and that was the name that they picked up. So he adjourned the proceedings. He sent him, he had him put back under guard. But it says in verse 23, he had some freedom and permit for his friends to take care of his needs and to be visited that way. Several days later, Felix comes. He brings his wife Drusilla with him. That is his second of 3 wives, as it turns out, that we know from non-biblical sources. But she's Jewish, and she wants to listen to Paul, and so they do, and he speaks about faith in Jesus and some other kind of implications and things from that. So Felix says in verse 25, all right, that's enough for now. You may leave. When I find it convenient, I will send for you. And it says, Luke tells us that he was hoping that Paul would figure out a way to give him a bribe. So he sent for him frequently and talked with him. But after 2 years, which was roughly about the term of this governor figure, Felix is moved on and nothing happens, and he is succeeded by someone whose name is Festus. Felix wants to grant a favor to the Jews, which again is just with the goal of keeping the peace, and so he leaves Paul in prison. So Paul is there for these 2 years. And then a new governor comes in, Festus, and he gains a hearing from Festus. He wants to figure out what's going on. So 3 days after arriving, Festus goes up from Caesarea to Jerusalem, and he meets with the chief priests and the Jewish leaders. They talk about the charges against Paul. They ask Festus for the favor, so they're kind of trying to play their cards shrewdly here, to have Paul transferred back to Jerusalem, but they have not forgotten, and they still plan to ambush him and kill him there. Festus invites some of the leaders to come up with him to Caesarea and to accuse him there, and so he goes up after a week and a half or so. Now he convenes the court. Paul comes in. This is chapter 25, verse 7. The Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, and they brought up the charges, but they were unable to prove anything. So Paul goes back and he makes his defense again. And in this case, he says that none of these charges are true, and no one has a right to hand me over to them. But he says, I appeal to Caesar. Now, appealing to Caesar means that he's going to be sent to Rome. He is a Roman citizen. He has the right to do that. So it says in verse 12, chapter 25, after Festus had conferred with his council, he declared, you have appealed to Caesar you shall go. So Paul is going to get to go to Rome after all. Now, Festus is in a little bit of a bind because he has to send him to Rome, and he needs to write up paperwork explaining why this person is being sent to the emperor. So he consults with King Agrippa and Bernice. Now, there's a couple of references here to Agrippa and Bernice and King Agrippa and Bernice. So who is Bernice? Bernice is King Agrippa's sister. His father was the king before him. He is, as it turns out, the last king of the Herodian dynasty, and you can hear in there the word Herod. So this is somebody, so Herod was King Agrippa's father, and his name is King Herod Agrippa, so that's his family name, and he's just referred to as Agrippa here in Acts. But Bernice is his sister. And apparently, they're presiding over this together. Now, if I've got my history straight, Agrippa will be killed in a Jewish revolt in the year 66. But this is before that time. This is in the years 58 to 59. So around 59, 60 is when we're dealing with here. So that's still a few years out. But they hear him, they listen to him, and they and he talks to that is Agrippa and Bernice hear out Festus, Governor Festus, and so he says, "Well, I'll give him a listen as well." So the next day they come in. He presents Paul to King Agrippa and Bernice to hear him, and in chapter 26 we find Paul speaking to King Agrippa. He says in verse 1, "To Paul, you have permission to speak for yourself." This is after a little bit of an introduction. And it says, "So Paul motioned with his hand and began his defense." Motioned with his hand, we've seen that a couple of times. That's kind of a rhetorical way of letting us know that he's beginning like sort of a discourse or a speech. Not that it wasn't something that Paul did, but it was sort of like a physical way to signal that you're about to get started speaking. In Jesus' day, the rabbis would teach sitting down, and so when they sat down, all the disciples knew that it was time to start paying attention, to gather around and to hear the lesson, because the rabbi had taken a seat and was about to start teaching. So Paul motioned with his hand and began his defense. So he goes through this. You can read it in chapter 26. And here we find the third and final of Paul's descriptions of what happened to him on the Damascus Road when Jesus appeared to him. And this one is a little bit different than the other two. Each of the three, again, Luke narrates the first one. Paul, Luke's telling the story the whole time, but the first one shows up just in narrative. The second one, Luke is telling us about a time when Paul describes it for the first time, and then here, a time when Paul's describing it for the second time. And so there's a couple of things that are a little bit different. One, in particular, is that it includes a saying that we don't really know much about just from everyday use, but he says that Jesus told him, this is chapter 26, verse 14, "We all fell to the ground, and I heard a voice saying to me in Aramaic," which is what Hebrew had kind of evolved into, and it was the way that it was the language in which Jewish people spoke commonly in those days. Hebrew would have been for the scriptures and in the synagogues as far as religiously, but Aramaic was just what they spoke day to day. So he hears him speaking in Aramaic, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads." Now, kick against the goads, what does that saying mean? Well, if you Google it, you'll find a variety of answers. What I'm referring to is from a commentary on background, and so this has sort of been scholarly vetted. And so here's what it says. It says, "Kicking against the goads was a Greek proverb about fighting a god, possibly originating with the classical Greek playwright Euripides. It's not cited in any of the others, and this person mentions that it would be appropriate to bring up with King Agrippa because he would have had enough of a Greek education to understand what this means without needing to have it explained to him. So Paul relates this. He's in front of someone who will understand what's being said. And then he goes on, and in this account, Jesus has more to say. He talks about what his calling will be. He tells him more about what his mission will be. And so in verse 19, Paul says to King Agrippa, "I was not disobedient to the vision from heaven, first to those in Damascus, then in Jerusalem, in all Judea, and then to the Gentiles." This sounds a little bit like like Paul's ministry plays a significant role in fulfilling the ministry of the church that Jesus described in Acts chapter 1, verse 8, where he said, "The Holy Spirit will come upon you and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." And so like the mission is radiating out from Jerusalem to reach all peoples in a way that Matthew would describe as the mission, to make disciples of all nations or ethnicities. The word in Greek is ethnos, and so all people groups. So Paul is saying that this has happened in his own ministry, that he's a part of what was pointed out at the very beginning of the book of Acts by Jesus himself. So he just goes on to talk about how God has stayed with him, and Festus ends up interrupting the defense in verse 24. It says, at this point, Festus interrupted Paul's defense. He says, "You are out of your mind, Paul. Your great learning is driving you insane. In seminary, I knew someone whose name was Paul, and in his email signature at the very bottom, this was the verse that he had quoted at the bottom. So take that for what you want. Paul says, I'm not insane. What I'm saying is true and reasonable. The king is familiar with these things, and I can speak freely of him. I'm convinced that none of this has escaped his notice. It was not done in a corner, so it's not been secretive. He's seen all of this, and he says to King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know you do. So he's appealing to his understanding of Jewish scripture. And Agrippa says to Paul in verse 28, chapter 26, do you think that in such a short time you can persuade me to be a Christian? Paul replied, short time or long, I pray to God that not only you, but all who are listening to me today may become what I am, except for these chains. And so I want to say a couple of things about this section, and then we'll close for today. So the first thing I would say is that Paul has an example, gives an example here of how when we're clear about our mission and our purpose and what we're aiming toward, when we're clear about our goal, we see opportunities that we might otherwise miss. So Paul is real clear about his circumstances, and he seizes this opportunity. He's on trial in Caesarea. He's before one governor, and then when his term ends, another governor. He never stops being available to make his case and to share about Jesus. But finally, he does know that his goal, his big picture goal, is to get to Rome. And so he sees an opportunity, and so he appeals to Caesar, and he knows that that will get him to Rome. So that keeps him on track for the goal that he's got for his mission to bring the gospel to Rome, to be able to preach himself in Rome and bring his teaching there. There's already some churches there. The gospel is spread there, but he wants to go himself. So that's one. And then the second one is something I hear here in this discussion with King Agrippa that I really just like. And that is a faith worth recommending. A faith worth recommending. Paul says to Agrippa, again, I said it just a moment ago, short time or long, that is, how quickly you can persuade me to be a Christian, Agrippa says, I pray to God that not only you, but all who are listening to me today may become what I am, except for these chains. So in other words, I'm preaching this stuff, I'm teaching this stuff because I believe it. I believe it. This is foundational for me. It shapes my entire life, my belief system, how I live, how I understand myself before God and before others. And this is, we know what Paul has been through, but he says this is the life that's worth living. And so the way I think about that is Paul knows that he has a faith worth recommending, not just a mission to accomplish, but a faith worth recommending. And that's, I believe that's really important for us to consider today. How are we investing and cultivating our faith so that it is a faith worth recommending to others? Whether they're convinced or not, that it would be something that we would passionately recommend to others. All right, that's it for this session. I look forward to the next one. We're coming to a close shortly, but in the next session, we will find Paul on his way to Rome. I'll see you then.